mystery that cannot be explained. An enigma that defies reason. A surprising and unexpected answer. To encounter such a mystery firsthand may change your life forever. Face to face with the greatest riddles of the ages, the world's most profound mysteries reach out and touch your life in ways you never imagined possible. Xtrem Mysteries.
January 1st of the year 2000 was the beginning of a new year, a new century, and a new millennium. All certainly good reasons to celebrate. But should we be celebrating the beginning of this particular millennium? Or approaching it with feelings of trepidation? As the year 2000 approached, the incidence of major earthquakes around the world was increasing almost geometrically. Could this be a sign of the end time, foretold by centuries by the ancient prophets and by Christ himself? The Old Testament prophet Daniel warned that in the last days there would be a time of trouble such as there never had been since there was a nation. Are we now beginning to see these events come to pass? In the middle of the 20th century, after 2,500 years of exile and being dispersed throughout the world, the Jews were returned to their biblical homeland, exactly as the prophet Ezekiel predicted. Is this the event that signals the beginning of the end? The new millennium, will it be filled with promise, or will it fulfill the promise of Armageddon? The year 2000 comes weighed down with prophecies of the end time, scholarly forecasts of doom, and thousands of years of warnings and predictions that unavoidable catastrophe is upon us. Are these just stories from the ancient past, or will these prophecies of the end time be fulfilled in our generation? We will examine some of the prophets and prophecies, ancient and modern, as they relate to the year 2000. We'll also see what the scientists can tell us about the immediate future and what we can look forward to in the fateful years that lie just ahead. We will examine closely the events that appear to be putting the fulfillment of centuries of prophecy in motion. For thousands of years, biblical prophecy has warned of a vast array of cataclysmic disasters and an apocalypse that will destroy most of the world and its population just prior to the millennium. But are we sure it is this millennium? More to the point, are we sure the new millennium has begun?
January 1 of the year 2000 has a nice ring to it. It's actually part of the waning moments of the second millennium. But then again, maybe it isn't. It all depends on which calendar you're looking at. There is the Hebrew calendar, which is a lunar calendar and undoubtedly the calendar that the ancient biblical prophets would have had in mind when speaking of things to come. According to the Hebrew calendar, this is the year 5760, which means there are still 240 years before the full 6,000 years are up. Then there's the Julian calendar. This calendar begins with the reign of Emperor Diocletian and was widely used for centuries. But Pope Gregory felt that it was unsuitable and commissioned Dionysius, a 6th century monk, to recast the calendar so that the years could be counted from the birth of Christ. Unfortunately, the monk, also known as Dennis the Short, miscalculated the birth of Christ, leaving us 4 years short. Nevertheless, what became known as the Gregorian calendar, the calendar we use today, became adopted, and the millennium actually began January 1st of 1997.
So we have either missed it already, or it's still 240 lunar years into the future. Or could it be somewhere in between? In any case, when we begin interpreting the signs of the times 2000, we would do well to remember that the year as it appears on our calendar is more of a reference point than an exact date. The term signs of the times comes from the book of Matthew in the New Testament of the Christian Bible, when Jesus told the Pharisees, "You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times." We are in much the same position as the Pharisees, facing what many believe to be the end time or last days. but still facing the same question. Can we interpret the signs that are supposed to point to the prophetic warnings? It is apparently a matter of some importance, since approximately 23% of the Bible is devoted to the end times. In the Old Testament, the prophets from Isaiah to Malachi speak primarily about the last days. In the New Testament, Matthew 24 and 25, Mark 13, Luke 21, and 2 Peter are devoted to such teachings, and of course, virtually all of the book of Revelations focuses on the end of the world as we know it. What are these signs that are at once so important that more than a fifth of the Bible is devoted to them, and so apparent that we should be able to recognize them? Ezekiel prophesied that the graves of the Jews would be opened and they would be returned to their ancient homeland, and their temple will be rebuilt on the holy site. The first part of that prophecy has been fulfilled in stunning detail. Among the most obvious of these signs today, as described in the Bible, is the promise of war and rumors of war. We are to expect a time of tribulation, such as there never has been since Israel was a nation. We are told that a time will come when all things that are good will be called bad, and bad things will be called good. A flaming mountain will crash into the sea with devastating results for all of mankind, and a star called wormwood will poison a third of the world's supply of water. A great leader will be swept onto the world stage. He will establish a new religion, require everyone to accept his mark. He will demand that he be worshipped as God, and those who refuse will be killed. Christ himself warned of earthquakes in diverse places, famine, and pestilence. And finally, we will see all the armies of the world gather together against Israel on the plains of Armageddon. This will be the last great battle, and one in which God himself will eventually take part. These are not all the signs, of course, but some of the more prominent ones. And certainly, they are signs we should be able to discern if indeed we are approaching the final hour. But that's not all we have to worry about. There have been other prophets over the centuries that have written about what many believe to be our day. A pious Catholic priest named Malachi O'Morgan lived nearly 1,000 years ago and wrote what has come to be known as the Papal Prophecy. In it, he named every pope in succession from 1134 to what he describes as the last pope. Since its publication, the Papal Prophecy, for reasons that will become clear, has often been compared to the predictions of Nostradamus, whose warnings and forecasts often had much to say about the popes. Over 400 years ago, Nostradamus wrote of air travel, submarines, royal and presidential assassinations, the French Revolution, both world wars, and the popes. None of these prophecies could have even been imagined in his own day, yet he committed them to paper with full confidence in their accuracy. But when Nostradamus was a young man, those who dared to express the prophetic gift were burned at the stake, so he wrote his predictions in enigmatic quatrains. Some of these word puzzles have remained unsolved to this day. History has unraveled most of them, however, and found them to be stunningly accurate. Nostradamus was a Jew who became a Catholic on pain of banishment. The King of France ordered all non-believers to convert or leave. Whatever its origins, Nostradamus seems to have embraced his Catholicism wholeheartedly, and his affinity with the popes is legendary. On one occasion, walking down a muddy path with his son, Nostradamus suddenly stopped, took the hand of a poor monk, and kissed it.
Father, you make us look like fools.
And why is that?
Because Brother Peretti is a monk of low birth, only lately delivered from a pigsty.
My son, it is required that you yield and bend a knee before His Holiness, the Pope. Come on.
45 years later, 19 years after the death of Nostradamus, the lowly swineherd became Pope Sixtus V. In 1555, 40 years before the discovery of Malachi O'Morgan's prophecy, Nostradamus published several predictions outlining the fate of the popes. His quatrains closely resemble the vision of Malachi. Both of them, for example, describe John Paul I as the moon and John Paul II as the works of the sun. But it is their agreement on the events surrounding the last pope that is particularly striking, even down to the name. Malachi was expansive in his description and very clear. Peter the Roman will lead his sheep to pasture in the midst of numerous tribulations. The city of 7 hills will be destroyed. The twilight settles, indeed, the depth of night before the promised dawn. Nostradamus characteristically couches his prediction in more obscure terms, referring to the last pope as the rock of the church, which in Catholic teaching would be Peter. Both men agree, however, that there will be great tribulations, and a man named Peter will serve as the final pope. Nostradamus, in fact, in one of his more direct quatrains writes, "O vast Rome, your ruin is approaching, not that of your walls, but of your lifeblood substance." Like Malachi O'Morgan, he sees not just the fall of the pope, but of the city as well. And if Malachi and Nostradamus are correct, there will only be 2 more popes. These prophecies were written some 600 years apart, yet the accuracy of their previous predictions and their amazing agreement on the last pope gives us pause. What exactly does lie ahead for our generation? Is it possible that prophets 2,000 years ago saw the wars and plagues of the 21st century? And why should we be particularly concerned about this century anyway? When it comes to accuracy, no one can hold a candle to the biblical prophets. Their record of prophecy is so far unblemished by any failure. Over 400 prophecies regarding the birth and life of the Savior were fulfilled in every respect. And many of us are witness to the fulfillment of prophecy in our own time, the prophecies of Ezekiel being just one example. But then the ancient prophets were judged by a different standard.
In ancient times, men called prophets had only 2 choices. They either were correct or they were stoned to death. Short-term prophecy was a risky business. You either had to be remarkably accurate or remarkably lucky.
There doesn't seem to be any reason to suppose the biblical prophecies regarding the final days before the second coming will be any less accurate. Still, is there anything that points to this millennium, whenever it begins or began, as being of special significance?
Well, for one thing, we're coming to the end of nearly 6,000 years of Earth's probation according to the Bible. But more importantly, the prophets of both the Old and the New Testament have given us specific signs to look for, events that will occur in the last days. Now, some of these have already taken place, but perhaps the most important one has occurred in our lifetime. Some 2,500 years ago, the prophet Ezekiel, speaking for God, said, "O my people, I will open up your graves and bring you up from them and bring you back to the land of Israel." He went on to say, "I will take the children of Israel out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land." And then he concluded, "I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel, and there will be one king over them." This is one of the most remarkable and specific prophecies of all, and many of us have lived to see it happen. Now, in the context, the opening of the graves refers to the national restoration of Israel. And on May 14, 1948, just 50 years ago, the Jews became a nation in their own land. I believe the prophecy of Ezekiel is being fulfilled to the letter. Secondly, Jesus Christ predicted there would be a dramatic increase in the number of earthquakes worldwide in the last days prior to his return. Now, in the first decade of this 20th century, there were 3 major earthquakes of a 6.0 or greater magnitude. Since that time, there's been a steady increase, especially in the last 20 years. For example, from 1980 to 1990, there were 310 major earthquakes. From 1990 to 1994, there were an astonishing 747 6.0 or greater magnitude earthquakes around the world.
But are these indeed the signs of the times? Christ was impatient with those who, he said, could easily read the signs of the weather, but were either unwilling or unable to read the signs that were given them by the prophets. Can we be accused of the same thing, or will our global technology help us to get a better read on the people and events that the prophets have fixed as warning signs of the last days? In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus tells his disciples what will happen at the end of the age.
You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom.
He also warned of other catastrophes.
There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All of these are the beginning of the birth pains.
The message is clear. There will be a series of events of ever-increasing magnitude that we should see as signs of the greatest event of all, his return. And while the earth groans, we can look for society in general to dwindle in unbelief. In 2 Timothy, Paul warns,
"There will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Have nothing to do with them."
Surprisingly, most people seem concerned not so much with if these things will happen, but when they will happen. 1,000 years ago, many people thought they would be witnesses to the end of the world. Why that was, we're not quite sure. But today, millions of people the world over point to the biblical evidence that seems to point to this generation as the end time. But does the Bible give us conflicting messages about interpreting the signs of the times?
Jesus admonished the Pharisees, the religious leaders of his day, for not understanding and paying attention to the prophetic signs of the coming of the Messiah. He said to them in effect, "You understand the signs of the weather, you understand the signs of the seasons, but you've misunderstood the signs of the coming of the Messiah." Yet Jesus also warned his disciples that no one would know the day nor the hour of his coming, only the Father. In fact, even the angels do not know the precise time of the coming of Jesus Christ.
On the one hand, Jesus seems to be saying that we should be able to read the signs of the times and know what these signs portend. On the other, we are told that no matter how carefully we study the matter, Christ will return at a day and an hour when he is least expected.
There is really no conflict between these two admonitions by Jesus. I believe the Pharisees were looking for a sensational supernatural sign. And Jesus was saying the signs of the times, as found in the Bible, are enough. Jesus, in fact, is calling upon us to live each day as if he could come really today before the day is done. On the other hand, he commands us to occupy and do his good business until he comes. So we must plan and work as if we have 100 years.
Still, the question first asked by the disciples hangs in the air. Master, when will all these things happen? Are we any nearer to an answer? Few prophets, ancient or modern, have ventured anything like a precise time for the beginning of all these events, but Isaiah did offer some clues. He said the very earth would reel to and fro like a drunken man. Is there any indication that might be happening? According to geologists, this area between the Fiji and Tonga Island groupings has always been one of the most seismologically active locations on Earth. But in 1967 and 68, something extraordinary happened. Massive seismic activity was registered here. Entire islands appeared and disappeared. On the other side of the globe, as far back as 1959, a Reuters dispatch from Athens reported water levels in several Greek harbors had dropped far enough to expose the seabed. And in 1975, Mount Etna erupted. Since that sudden and surprising volatile event, the Earth does seem to have taken on a life of its own. Earthquakes continue to increase at an alarming rate. Volcanoes, new and old, have increased their activity, while sea levels have dropped precipitously in some areas. Could it be that the increase in volcanic activity, the eruption of Mount St. Helens, earthquakes, floods, and other natural disasters actually herald the beginning of these Earth changes? Could it be that the prophecy of Isaiah did in fact pinpoint the beginning of the end?
In my view, the literal fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy regarding the return of the Jews to their homeland in 1948 signals the beginning of the end times. It seems to me the signs of the times are with us, in fact have been for a while.
If the prophecies foreshadowing the end of the world have been and are now being fulfilled, what of those prophecies that are yet to be fulfilled? Virtually all of them have worldwide implications. John the Revelator, for example, tells us that in the last days, the stars will fall from the skies.
And the stars of heaven fell unto earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?
Could such a thing happen? Biblical scholars insist the prophecies will be fulfilled literally, and that all of them are certain to come to pass. Furthermore, Nostradamus warns that earth-shaking fires will cause tremors around the new city, and the sky will burn at 45 degrees. Fire approaches the new city. New York City, it seems, is also in jeopardy. But from what? Can modern science provide any insight into how stars and fire might fall from the sky? On June 16, 1999, the BBC reported that a newly discovered asteroid, a kilometer in width, was heading toward Earth and would miss by only 1/10 the distance between the Earth and the Moon. It is due to arrive in 2027. Shades of Nostradamus.
Scientists in 1999 discovered an asteroid about a half-mile wide, and researchers at the Smithsonian Biophysical Observatory calculated on August 7th, 2027, that this asteroid would miss the planet Earth by about 23,000 miles. Other scientists are quite concerned that when it makes its next pass in 2039, that there could be a collision due to the gravitational pull of this asteroid by the planet Earth.
Astronomers warn that a collision is only one of a range of possibilities for this chunk of rock. And according to a report in CNN Interactive, if it did hit the Earth, it would have the force of 2 million atomic bombs. If the astronomers are right, we may all see the fulfillment of at least one of John's prophecies. But what of the Nostradamus warning that fire would burn New York City at 45 degrees?
The SOHO Solar Observatory satellite has been monitoring the sun's activity for the last several years. The spectacular eruptions on the surface of the sun, all the particles that are sent streaming out towards the Earth. A number of things happen when these particles get near the Earth. We see spectacular northern lights in the nighttime sky. Radio communications are disrupted. Even electrical transmission is endangered. Solar activity is on an 11-year cycle, and it's going to reach its next maximum in the next year or two.
But that wasn't the case in 1989. Then a huge solar cloud slammed into the Earth in eastern Canada with disastrous results. Unable to absorb the massive electrical charge of the cloud, power lines were overloaded, and in a matter of minutes, the power grid was shut down. So great was the cloud's electrical force that power lines remained loaded and intermittent flickering was noted even after the power stations went offline. In 1989, the sunspot activity caused hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. The experts tell us that next time, the damage could be far worse. But is it just natural disasters that mark the last days? Or can we look for man-made catastrophes as warnings of the end time? The ancient prophets have said that in the end, all the nations of the world will come against Israel. Many believe that with its large Jewish population, that couldn't include the United States. Yet, in 2002, when the United Nations voted on a resolution condemning Israel, with no mention of the Palestinian suicide bombings, every nation voted for it, including the United States. Are we living in the end times?